So next we'll be hearing from Janet Ranganathan. Janet's the Vice President for Science and Research at the World Resources Institute. Janet's experience spans several areas of sustainability, including natural resource use and greenhouse gas reporting, and will be presenting today on a collection of strategies to improve future food sustainability. Janet?
Great, thank you very much. Thanks to Jessica and to Anna for the invite. I've kind of already learned a ton here. I need to approach this topic with some humility. The World Resource Institute isn't a hallowed academic institute. The only thing I will say in its defense, two things really, that we are about research into action, a think, come, do tank. And secondly, we do actually have a centralized peer review process independent of the program staff producing the research that I would say is on par with most academic peer reviewed journals. I was asked to do two things, and I only have 20 minutes, but to both go broad and talk about a menu of solutions more broadly than diets, but then to do a deep dive on diets and specifically the question of how do we shift diets, learning in particular from the private sector. So I've got 20 minutes, so I should talk really slowly to make sure I can fill it with the information to cover those two areas. So I'm largely going to draw on these two reports, but we have another final report coming out soon. I'm going to cover a lot of ground here. You can look at the individual reports, they're all online, they're all free. But this is the question, and I actually think it's kind of the question of the day. It's a question for humanity. I mean, I've worked on almost every environmental issue over the 23 years I've been at the World Resources Institute, and every time I kept coming back to the issue of food when I worked on deforestation or climate change or water or eutrophication or biodiversity loss. All roads led back to food. So it's kind of the mother of all sustainability issues. In fact, I would say that all the other issues we work on at WRI are an annex to this issue. But that's the challenge we have. And it requires a balancing act of three things. Firstly, we've got to close this calorie gap. It's not just a distribution issue. We've got a gap of 56% in terms of calories. And that's including a baseline, a lot of assumptions around the extension of the agricultural footprint, around 540 million hectares assumed, even with this gap. With large yield improvements that are on par with what had happened with the Green Revolution, and can we actually expect to have those even in just the baseline? The second thing is this issue. 28% of the world's people are employed in agriculture, which represents about 3% of GDP globally, maybe about 1% in the United States. So that number, 28% of the people, but only 3% of the GDP, tells you there's a lot of people not making much money. I just came back from Chicago last week. Mars had actually hosted this Farmer Income Lab. They're really concerned about the income of farmers in their supply chain. They're not making a living wage. They're moving to cities. They're moving out. You've got to address that issue too, while closing that gap. Number three, and we've already heard a lot about this, this is the environmental footprint. A quarter of greenhouse gas emissions and rising rapidly. About 10% of that is from land use. 37% of the land mass, and actually 50% if you take out ice and deserts, is devoted to food production. And then, of course, the water withdrawals, which we talked about. Oops, go back, I'm getting too fast here. But so those are the three things. And one way we've been doing this unsustainably is through the extension of the agricultural footprint. In my lifetime, it's the agricultural footprint's expanded by about 500 million hectares. That's about the 60% of the size of the contiguous United States of America. And the same amount, a little bit more actually, is expected and built into that baseline that I showed you for the food gap. So we can't keep doing that. So at WRI, we realize that there's no silver bullet. And actually shifting diets, which is the focus of this subject, is actually a shinier silver bullet than many of the others. But we have to also think about reducing, increasing production and reducing growth and consumption. And we need all of the solutions on the table. And let me just go to this menu. So these are the production ones. And I could spend 20 minutes on each of these items, but they're pretty critical. Boosting yields through crop breeding, although we've done a lot there, and a large part by introducing new inputs, fertilizers, and increasing the area of under-irrigated land, there's still a lot to be done there. And that doesn't have to be genetically modified. It could be the other GM, Gregor Mendel. There's a lot to be done now by bringing modern genomics. I was sort of like, We don't have to breed in the dark anymore. We can bring modern genomics to actually speed up that process of more conventional crop breeding. And there's a whole lot of work to be done on the orphan crops. There's not been much research there, yet they cover a lot of acreage of land, particularly where those poor farmers are. Improving soil and water management. About, I think something like 25% of the world's food-producing land, the soil's degraded, particularly in dry lands. Bringing forest backs into the agricultural system, rainwater harvesting, all good things to do for resilience reasons as well. Expanding onto degraded lands, depending on your definition of degraded lands, it could be around the area of about 1 billion hectares globally. So that's a place where actually I do want to see some extensification and intensification too. Sustainably increasing livestock productivity. I think a lot of the research on intensification has been on crops, but actually the land that's devoted to livestock production is about 2 times the land for croplands. So we've really got a lot of low-hanging fruit still there, in my view, maybe not so much in the US, but certainly in other countries. And ruminants, as you've heard, beef in particular, which has a very large environmental footprint and perhaps health footprint, there's almost like a Cinderella of the research. So there's a lot we can do there about increasing sustainably the productivity of livestock. Same thing with wild fish. Actually, we're going to probably have to bring wild fish capture down to make it more sustainable. So we need to increase the productivity of agriculture, which was at first a nightmare in terms of how we were doing it from an environmental perspective. But again, there's lots of low-hanging fruit there to improve that. And we need the agriculture output to almost double to help fill that gap. On the consumption side, we've already heard about reducing food loss and waste. It's about 1/3 in terms of food weight globally lost between farm and fork, or about 1/4 if you look at it in terms of calories. So here at WRI, we've been looking at a couple of things, a protocol to how you measure it, so hopefully what gets measured gets managed, but also building a coalition of leaders, heads of supermarkets and companies and states and countries, they're called Champions 12.3, who've made commitments to reduce that food loss, waste in half, and to share some of the strategies for how to do it. But and in fact, if food loss and waste was a country, in terms of GHG emissions, it will be number 3 behind China and the US. So just think about that. It's wasted water, it's wasted land, it's wasted greenhouse gas emissions, it's a wasted money. So we have to get on that one. Achieving basement level fertilities. I mean, there is still some low-hanging fruit in sub-Saharan Africa. We know how to do it. Their fertility rate in the last 5 years was around 5. It's predicted to go to 3.2 by 2050. We can speed that up by getting things we should be doing anyway. Keeping girls in school, providing reproductive health services, and reducing infant child mortality. So we have to work on that too. Reducing biofuel demand for food crops. So to meet a 20% biofuel target in the energy system in 2050, and some countries do have a 20% biofuel target, would actually require almost the entire biomass harvest of 2,000. So think about the extraordinary potential for competition there between food and fuel. So that's something to deal with. And I'll shift in diets. I'm going to focus on this a little bit and how to shift them. This is just, why to shift them and what to shift them, with beef being right up there. You already heard of that, so I don't need to dwell on that. I would say that a lot of efforts to date in practice have focused on education, information, and absence. And although they're important, they're not suffice. They don't work. And I think Jenny, who last spoke, she gave me a very nice setup here. So at WRI, we think, how do we shift people? So we could have gone the government route, looked at sort of taxes and subsidies and other mechanisms and guidelines. We could have gone the technology route. But we decided to look at the private sector, because the private sector is fabulously good at shifting people. I mean, that's what marketing is in the business of this. So with a bunch of marketing, behavioral economists, we reviewed 20 successful consumption shifts that already happened and said, hey, what can we learn from these? And from that, we recognized that there were some commonly occurring strategies that was prevalent in, one or more of them that was prevalent in each of those shifts that we'd seen. So we created this shift wheel. So the 4 strategies there are minimize disruption. So the people who are working on fake meat, they're playing to that one. They so you're not disrupt you, you've got to change to have something that looks like it, something that you can put on the barbecue or whatever. The reason why soya milk, some merchants are actually marketing it in a refrigerated section because that's where people habitually go to get their milk. So put the soya milk there, even if it doesn't need to be refrigerated. Number 2, sell a compelling benefit. Don't tell them why it's not good for you, it's bad for the environment or whatever, and hope they're shipped to something else. But think about what the consumer wants. They want taste, they want affordability, they do want nutrition, they do want environment, okay? Maximizing awareness, and this is a tried and tested strategy by the private sector. It's like, why the things they want to shift the most are going to be the end of the aisle or at the top of the menu. And the things that they don't want you to buy that maybe have a lower margin are going to be at that lower level in the supermarket, that area where no one goes. And then evolving social norms. If you think about the last time you saw a man in public cooking food, what was he cooking? He's probably cooking, a beef burger on a barbecue. I mean, I'm just sort of saying there is a sort of association between machism and meat. That's just one example. Jenny talked about others earlier, but we do need to think about how we address that and evolve those. And there's more specifics that I don't have time to get into, but let me give you an example. This is a nice example from Britain. The UK government in around 2010 said that we want to take 1 billion units of alcohol out of the marketing system. They're worried about lager louts and all of the problems that go with that. So they made this challenge to the beer beverage sector. They said, let's have you do this voluntarily. If not, there's the basic threat of taxes. Molson, who makes Carling, they actually wanted to shift consumers away from high alcohol to lower alcohol to a product which they ought to have, which was low alcohol beer, so they wouldn't lose market share. But you can see a number of barriers there. Now, people don't want low alcohol beer. They don't like the taste of it. Is that sort of the way you have to manufacture it? It gives this taste. It's not bought. It was typically as I say, it was on that lower shelf. It wasn't up there with the higher alcohol products. And there wasn't really much incentive. It was there wasn't a profitable beer for the Tesco's and whatever, or the Walmarts to put it in a prominent place. So they took a number of actions. So they found that if they masked that nasty taste that low alcohol beer had with either a lime, ginger, or lemon, they positioned it, they renamed it. They didn't call it low alcohol beer. They just refreshed it and gave a new name, like Carling Zest. It so happened fortuitously the UK government actually reduced the excise, the tax, on low alcohol beer and put it up higher on alcohol. And so the low alcohol beer was a 2.7% alcohol, the higher ones are 4.7%. So the price came down. But instead of passing that on to the consumers, they passed it on to the retailers so they would give it more prominent space because they were therefore getting more margins from selling that. And there it is. It's probably one of the most successful rebrandings, I think, in the history of consumer rebrandings. And you can sort of see the strategies that were deployed there on the minute. So disguising the change, the use of ginger, lime, delivering a compelling benefit. It's a refreshing, low-calorie drink. And then enhancing its display by passing on some of the margins from the reduced excise tax to the retailers. I don't have time to go through another one, but Unilever did pretty much the same thing, trying to shift people from pollock to cod. Some of the barriers there. One of their research scientists discovered that actually pollock had a higher omega-3. People eat fish fingers tend to be the kids. When my first introduction to fish in the United Kingdom was always a cod fish finger. Similar thing, for Unilever, we're shifting to pollock, reduced its raw material costs. Again, they passed on some of that to the retailers to encourage more of it, to kind of see how it works. Now, the thing is that we then decided that we wanted to focus on the food services sector. We want to shift people's diet. We thought retail's too hard for us. I haven't got time to go into the reasons, but we're focused on the food service sector. Three things. In the US, as much money is spent in consuming food outside the house as inside the house. We feel like the incentives of the food service sector are aligned with shifting diets. They don't sell food, they sell meals. So if we actually shift them out of meat to plant, that's a good thing. And then the number third, habits often formed outside they're taken back into the house, so we can actually maybe change the habits. So we created this Better Buying Lab to experiment with this with a group of food service companies. We're experimenting in the US and the UK, so context matters. We're not trying to shift diets in Kenya. We're focused on developed countries, very over-consuming countries. We have a number of collaborators, perhaps some of them are in the room, to help us do that and to do that in a sort of nutritiously balanced way. And we kind of experiment with coming up with ideas, testing them out with our food service companies, learning from them, and sharing more broadly and scaling. And right now we're kind of focused on 3 areas. One about how you communicate around the language of food, and then about popularizing dishes rich in plants, and the right targets and markets. So a little bit on the language side. So if you looked on a menu and you saw something that said, a baked squash with rice and greens, okay, that's maybe what you're presenting with in a restaurant, or you could be presented with something that's roasted butternut squash with sweet and spicy coconut sauce and fresh Thai basil. Okay, it's the same product, but it's just described very differently. Which is more attractive to you? We work with LSE. This is an example of that. Just so we looked at, if you keep the vegetarian dishes in a box called vegetarian, guess who orders from the box that's vegetarian? Well, they're not the people we shipped. I mean, the last speaker said, well, if the fake meat tastes like meat, the vegetarians won't eat it. I'm not worried about it. I'm not trying to shift them. They're already shifted. So just taking the food out of the vegetarian box and putting it into the main menu and maybe not labeling it as vegetarian. With this study we did with about 760 people in the UK, it increased 56% the ordering of the vegetarian dishes. So this sort of positioning and language matter. This is another study. It wasn't done in the context of the Better Buying Lab, but I'll mention it anyway. It's with Stanford. And you can see that they looked at 4 different ways of framing the same food. So indulgent, the first column, basic, healthy, restrictive, and healthy, positive. And one of the things here is that actually if you label something as healthy, that might not let it jump off the menu in terms of ordering. And actually that's kind of what they saw. So there you see those 4 framings. So the indulgent, remember the butternut squash I gave you? Had a significantly, larger number of people selecting it, 25%, than in the basic condition. And then healthy restrictive was less than the non-healthy labeling. And then healthy positive, still less than basic, but not as bad as a healthy restrictive. So language, I think, does matter, but I don't want to oversell this. This is nascent. We still, context matters, who you're segmenting to. But I think this is a fertile research area to pursue. The second strategy we're employing is if you look at what we call power dishes, that refers to the kind of menus that you see in many, many restaurants, mainstream restaurants. So there's this list of 25 that are the most prevalent items that you're going to get if you go into a restaurant in the United States. And guess what? There's only 1 vegetarian dish on it. If you looked at the power dishes in the United Kingdom, there'd be 2 there. And veggie sandwich wrap, I mean, it's not exactly really exciting, is it? So we have been focused, working with our companies in the Better Buying Lab to actually increase the number of food items on there that are power dishes that you'd see regularly on there. And we picked 3 things: the blended burger, veggie bowl, and avocado club. And we started with the blended burger. And we've been working to introduce a blended burger that's 30% mushroom overlay and 70% beef. So we're not no meat. I mean, that's not going to sell, but we've reduced the amount of meat in it. And Sodexo's now introduced this. A nice example from Sainsbury's, a retailer in the UK with shops. They actually had something called meat-free breakfast. And then they called it Builder's Breakfast, by the way, but it was meat-free. But the sales increased 93% in the week after they changed the names. But we're working the blended burger and getting that orange light. And there's some of the benefits of just taking 30% of that beef out, given there's about 1 billion beef burgers sold in the United States annually. But just taking 30% out, it's like taking 2.3 million cars off the United States roads, about the same amount of cars in the state of San Diego. We also know that a lot of companies have actually made commitments to GHG reduction, but they often don't. They all think about, traveling and energy and travel, but getting them to think about, the supply chain. So companies in the food services like Panera, they made a commitment. You can see there how their GHG emissions inventory breaks down, with the purchased goods being a very large proportion of that. Now that, you can look at meats as a significant portion. So we're saying this is actually a contribution to your greenhouse gas target as well. And so we're looking at expanding on that work. So I'm still on the orange. I could go on forever here, but there is no easy solution to this. We've actually we've got some modelling come out that looks at both the GHG benefits and land use benefits of all of those menu of solutions that we talked about. Shifting diets, shifting away from meat doesn't do much to the calorie gap. We're just changing the way calories are served, but it has an enormous effect on land and GHG emissions, more than any of the other menu items. Food loss and waste was another big one. Sustainable intensification of livestock and crops was a big way to sort of close the food gap. So hope that's of interesting. Thanks again. We're just really starting on this, and we've still got a lot of work to do and need some good research around it. Thank you.